It's all right.
You gotta do what you gotta do.
Okay, so we were talking about Frans Hals last week, and one of the things I was trying to emphasize as we looked at his works was the degree to which, when we look at Frans Hals' works, one of the things that he's done quite successfully is to take lessons he's learned as a genre painter and use them to make his portrait paintings better, right? And we left off with the 1627 banquet of the St. George Civic Guard, where we can see numerous figures that appear in this now being enlivened, number 5 up there, by Hals's concurrent, right? It's not like it's earlier, even though we looked at it earlier. It's concurrent engagement with these single genre scenes. This is really what makes these such terrific pictures and makes them so vibrant and lively, which is, everybody said this, right? That the paintings looked as if they were painted from life. When you know each person just sat for his portrait, and then Frans Hals made everything else up, right? They're not sitting there holding that pose long enough for him to paint that picture, right? It's an extraordinary piece of artifice. And everywhere we look throughout, there are these images that show this sort of interconnection between his activity as a genre painter and his activity as a portrait painter, as if he's blurring the lines between the two, to the degree that some of them we really don't know what's going on with this. And the other thing we were talking about is how these portraits lead to other commissions. The people that like this kind of painting seem to have been a circle. These people all know each other, and they're all interconnected. Now, part of that interconnection is through social class, right? Remember that the people that belong to the St. George Civic Guard are the upper crust of Haarlem society, right? And this is a civically appointed position with a term. It's not an elected position or anything. And these people all really kind of come from the same social circles. But at the same time, there seems to be a great sharing of patronage, a sort of overlap, that one work will lead to another. So remember that that's the same guy a few years earlier, right? That's Olickan a few years earlier with shorter hair, which I don't think looks anywhere near so good on him as the longer hair does, right? The last of these, which I don't think we got to yet, right? We didn't get here, I don't think, of the St. George Civic Guard is, remember that each one of these marks the end of their tenure. So the officers and sergeants are all elected for a 3-year term. At the end of the 3-year term, they commemorate the finish of that with a group portrait. There are others by other artists, right? Frans Hals is not the only one that did them. He's the only one we kind of remember because he's so good at it, right? And so here's the very last one. And the captain is the second guy from the left, right? And we know because they're numbered. And again, that sort of helps us to read them, right? So there is the captain. His name is Johan Claes Loo, L-O-O, right? The British word for bathroom. And he's numbered number 1. It looks like a J, right? There, and he's again caught in conversation. Regular member of town council, right? Again, these are really well-established citizens of Haarlem. Interestingly, in looking him up a little bit, he had previously served on the other Civic Guard in Haarlem. So here's the St. Adrian Civic Guard, and that's him. Again, third from the left, looking directly at us, as captain of the St. Adrian Civic Guard 6 years earlier. I don't know brand loyalty, right? Part of me, I was sort of thinking they're like baseball team players used to be, before Red Sox players would go to the Yankees and even think about it, right? But, somebody like Carl Yastrzemski, who would never dream of playing for anybody but the Sox, right? I thought that's the way it was, that you belonged to one guard or the other. But obviously, here at the end of a 3-year term, we see Lowe seated as the captain of the St. Hadrian Civic Guard, right? Then he has to take 3 years off, right? That was the rule. You couldn't do back-to-back terms. And after 3 years off, he becomes captain of the St. George Guard, right? And I don't know enough about these people to know how common that was, that you would flip from one group to the next. But it's kind of an important side note, right? As we're trying to figure out how they approach this. So there he is, 6 years apart in these two different pictures, right? As the head of each of these, right? Now, in our picture from 1639, the one on the left that's now obscured, a number of the people that are in the guard with him are members of his family. That's another interesting thing about the sociology of this, right? Of these group portraits, is that his family appears regularly within the portrait, and there are numerous family members. And I don't know if he could practice nepotism and get them in there where he wanted them, or if that was just the norm, or if there's just, because it's such a tight circle, that should be expected, right? I don't know the answer to that. But in this particular, I was kind of struck by the fact that that's his son, number 16. You can barely see it on his sash. It's a little difficult to pick out on the sash. But that's his son, Nicholas Lowe. And again, if we think about this tight web of patrons, Nicholas Lowe had married the sister of Olakan, right? So that's his brother-in-law. So again, this is web, right, of interconnection. So he is Olakan's brother-in-law, as well as the son of the leader of this group. Don't worry, there's not a test, right? Lowe's son-in-law is in orange, number 4, right? Florence van der Hoof, married to Lowe's daughter. Right? So again, a very tight web. And his brother-in-law, Lowe's brother-in-law, the elderly gent, number 5, in white, Nicholas Garrett, right? Grauert, sorry. Yeah. So we have 3 different members of his family as members of the group as well, and fairly close members of it. Now, in addition to these family connections, right, they're all numbered for us. Up at the top in the center, number 19, it's above his head, instead of being on his sash like the rest. Legend has it that this is Frans Hals. Legend has it that that's a self-portrait, right? Now, what's the proof for it? One, because it's difficult. He was never an officer of the guild. And I was looking, but I couldn't find it in time, what role he played, right, in the guild. But he was a member nonetheless, right? He was a member of the St. George Civic Guard. But he was never an officer, so he doesn't belong there. So if it is a self-portrait, it's a huge honor to be included with this very elite group of people. And at the end of his career of painting these things, right, that might make some sense. You know, as a thanks, Frans, for all the good work, right? The other thing that is important is there was a plaque that was part of the frame, right? An engaged plaque from the beginning. This is why the numbers are on their chest, is the plaque identified them, right? And here's the plaque at the bottom. It's kind of a fuzzy picture, right? And it tells us who's in charge, Johan van Loo, right, and the others. And then it breaks them down by rank, and it gives us the number and the name. And there is no number. Well, there it is, actually. It says... I thought there was no number. It said 8 of the 18, but I'm just not seeing Frans Hals painter. But it looks like it's been tucked in a little tightly, whereas number 19 should go over here. And that might have been added later. Right, but there, even so, in the group, if you see how the group is going to fit down below, there's kind of no room for number 19, right? In the same way that he seems sort of tucked in behind everybody as well, right? So this is our evidence that's Frans Hals, that there's this legend behind it being Frans Hals, right? And the interesting thing about that is that if that is indeed a portrait, The question is this him as well? Right? That it looks similar enough for some people to suggest that our little portrait of one of these guys, painted around the same time, it's not dated, but stylistically fits into this time period, that this might be him as well. Of course, there's some problems. He's wearing orange versus blue, and this indicates where you were within the Guard, right? What part of the regimen you belonged to was the three different colors that you would wear, orange, blue, and white. And he's not wearing blue as he is in the portrait. But he's got that sort of hooked nose, right? The moonish face, kind of raggy, craggy, moonish face. That leads us to think that this is potentially a self-portrait of Frans Hals. The other evidence for that is that this is one of only two solitary members of the Guard that he ever did, at least in uniform, right? And he's also not dressed. The other one's an officer, right, in uniform. This one's not an officer. He's wearing that it's kind of a funny outfit because he's kind of chubby, isn't he? But beyond that, he's wearing this leather breastplate, which says that he's a lance holder, right, a lancer. And but he's wearing it with the sash, but he's wearing it also with, even though he's got the leather breastplate on, he's got the lace collar over the top of it, right? So he's both a member and a gentleman, if you will, at the same time. It's an awkward pairing of clothing, right? But that's the one of only two solo members, which, again, astounding for the National Gallery, established only in the late 30s, right? The idea in the late 30s and opened to the public around 1940, could get as important a work of that in and of itself, regardless of whether it's a self-portrait, right? We've got one of only two in the world, Frans Hals' solitary portraits of one of these militiamen in uniform. But then to possibly have it be a self-portrait is itself also pretty extraordinary for our little collection put together so very, very late. Right? Typical for these portraits, the face, right, is very well resolved, right? The brush strokes in the face are often blended. There's little highlights here and there, the shine on the side of his nose, right, picking up. Again, that vibrancy that's so typical for Frans Hals. But the brush strokes around the face tend to have a sharper focus. And that's in the way Frans Hals, I think we talked about this last week, is trying to tell us how to look. Right? He's trying to front load your interaction with the piece. And the same way that when I'm looking right at John, he'll be more in focus than when I look over here and see him out of the corner of my eye. Right? Frans Hals seems to understand that element of vision and says what you'll do then is you'll look at his face. Right? That's where you're going to end up focusing your attention. And then as we move away from the face, right, then we get this Frans Hals that we love, which is the extraordinary vibrancy of these broken, unblended brushstrokes that just sort of dash across the canvas and look as if it was painted in a single sitting in no time at all, right? And everywhere we look, this is the stuff that we really respond to, I think, given our modern age, post-impressionism and whatnot. I started to read, but simply didn't have the time, an essay on the rediscovery of Frans Hals in the 19th century. But there was a very distinct sort of opening of painters' eyes to what he was up to in the 19th century with artists like Manet, and had an important impact on Impressionism, French painting in the 19th century. Right? The last thing I wanted to point to was something I mentioned when we were there about these two pictures, is I think, and I'm going to do some more research on this might be a paper that I would do, is that the Night Watch owes its legacy to this picture. I have this in the back of my mind that there's a lot of little circumstantial evidence to point this through, and I can't imagine that nobody's ever seen this before. One thing that's worth noting right off the bat is that you'll notice the Night Watch is full length, whereas all of the ones that we've seen from Haarlem have been half length, right? They've been cut off at the knees. We haven't seen people's feet yet in any of the Haarlem group portraits. And that's because this was just the difference of the norm, right? In Amsterdam, the norm was full length. So just as Hals is doing these things in Haarlem, where the norm is half length, there's a number of other artists that are also doing similar things in Amsterdam. And when we were there, we didn't go. There were a couple of them that were on loan to the National Gallery for many years. They finally went back after like 5 years here, right? And we didn't go to that museum because I find them kind of dull, right? This is the really good one. And the rest of them sort of just, they don't really float my boat. But there were a couple of them in the Rijksmuseum when we were there, right? But what I was struck by when we stood in front of this picture, we turn around to leave, and there it is on the wall. It's the biggest one he ever did, right? It's his last, it's his biggest. I was struck by, when you're in front of it, the fellow in yellow, so that sounds bad, the officer in yellow, really stands out. He's highlighted, and if you look at the faces around him, there's a light on him that really makes him stand out. And Rembrandt has done very much the same thing in The Night Watch. And if we add to that this idea that Rembrandt's tucked his self-portrait in the back of The Night Watch, right, almost like an afterthought, looking out from behind the soldiers, in a position that's analogous to where Frans Hals's portrait appears, then it becomes kind of a more interesting idea, right? And Rembrandt would have known Hals. He would have known of his work very, very well, right? And if we think about what we know about Rembrandt, he's a man of ambition, right? We know nothing else about Rembrandt. We know that he is a man of ambition. He's got an idea in his head from when he first starts as a painter as a teenager, right, that he's going to be a great painter. He's got that in the back of his mind. And part of being a great painter, we've talked about this with Rembrandt again, is to find out who's the best out there and try to beat them at their game, right? Lastman, right, the greatest history painter in Amsterdam. I'm going to learn from him. I'm going to do what he does. I'm going to do it better, right? Titian, Raphael, Lucas van Leyden, right? All of these artists who for him are part of what inspires him, but also what inspires him is to take what they've done and do it a little bit better, right? Bigger, stronger, more dramatic, more human. Right? And so if he's going to take on a commission, his first commission for a group second commission for a group portrait, right? The first was the anatomy lesson of Dr. Tulp, which was a great, howling success, right? Here's the biggest painting he'll ever do in his life. And it's a group portrait of a militia group. Well, he's going to look around. He's going to figure out who's out there, okay? So Hals is going to be on his radar screen, even though Hals is in Haarlem and he's in Amsterdam. That said, this one, Frans Hals started this in 1633, left it more or less unfinished. Peter Cotta came in and finished it in 1636. This is hanging in the building where the Night Watch is going to go. Okay? And this is now hanging in the Rijksmuseum in the same room as the Night Watch. It's off to the side. Right? But this is there. So Hals is there. Right? Even if he doesn't get out to Haarlem very much. Okay, looking at this room, all of the portraits that are there, Hals is going to stand out. Right? I want to do better than that. Hals has made it more vibrant. I'm going to go a step further than that. I'm going to add some narrative to this sucker, right? And that could easily have inspired Rembrandt to look at the works in Haarlem. It's not that far away. We also know that Hals had come to Amsterdam to paint this, right? He was there in 1632 for a prolonged period of time while working on this portrait. And as we heard when we were in Amsterdam, that there's a certain way of painting lace that Rembrandt seems to have borrowed from Frans Hals, right? Painting the negative space over the top of the white, right? Was a Hals trick that Rembrandt picks up on lace patterns. So there's enough to suggest that there's a connection here, right? And that as Rembrandt is setting out to paint the Night Watch, he's looking for who's the best. Now, The other interesting thing that we learned when we were abroad is that Rembrandt's house, right, was purchased with the money he got from this painting, the down payment from this, right? Remember that there's 18 guys, each of them pays him like 100 guilders, which is a lot of money, right, to be painted in this. And at the time that Rembrandt paints it, he probably painted it in sight. I can't imagine he's painting that house, right? There's no room in that house to paint a painting this big. He's got to have had the mural up in the room it's going to go in and paint it there, right? But he gets the money from it, buys the house. We know he buys the house in 1639, so that's the first payment of that work, is 1639. That's the year that Hals paints, Wi-Fi. That's when Hals paints this, 1639. So this painting's wet, right, when Rembrandt gets paid for the Night Watch. So I'm thinking that there's got to be something going on here, right? And if I were sitting where you are, on the other side of the learning spectrum, and had time to do things I want to do rather than what I have to do, I'd be going on and immediately looking to see if anybody's written about this yet, right? And then go a step further and start to put this all together and figure out how I can prove this point. Is there something to be said here that no one's said before? Maybe there is. Maybe this would be my off-topic research, because it's not really what I normally do. 17th century. Yeah.
Why did Frans Hals not finish the Liederkranz?
I don't know. That's a really good question. There's a big study of it. There was a big Frans Hals exhibition in the early 90s at the National Gallery, and the catalog was written by Seymour Slive, and I have a copy of it because I got it for like $5, at Second Story Books, the annex.
Okay.
I love that place. And I picked it up because I wanted it. And I started to read about it, but I haven't figured out why because they've done a lot of technical studies on it, right? Why was it left unfinished in 1633? I really don't have an answer to that. I don't know. I'm sure someone does, right, in the records. It could be that he got distracted, had to move back to Haarlem to do another picture over there. Because there are some dated 1633 in Haarlem as well, right? One of the group portraits in Haarlem is from 1633. So that could well be as simple as that, right? That he's called back, but I don't know the answer, unfortunately. So Hals, after this point, in the 40s and 50s, his works get a little bit more dour, especially the group portraits. And if you remember those late ones of the regents of the old men's home where he lived. Right? And it's also worth noting that at this point, Hals was a bit of a late starter. He's like he's in his late 60s by this point, right, or 60s anyway. Doesn't look it so much in those portraits. That's the other issue. Is the portraits look a little bit younger than he is, but maybe he just aged well. But he was in his 80s in the 50s. So just add 30 to most of these, and you get to sort of where he was in these images. So anyway, some interesting questions come up with this. Moving forward, Judith Leister is obviously connected somehow, right? I mean, if you look at Leister pictures immediately adjacent to Frans Hals's, then you can see why many people thought that some of her works were his and were misattributed to him, right? Her style definitely shows Hals's influence with jittery, open brushwork, tightening up around the face and loosening up the further we get away from it. Her thematic choices are obviously in step with Hals's dramatic choice. People immediately jump to the conclusion that she was a pupil, but there's no proof. We know of many people who studied under Hals, but she is not recorded as doing so. That doesn't mean she wasn't. It may mean that there were different rules for her as a woman in a man's world. And I think for Leister, that's a big issue of being a woman in a man's profession. That she may not have been recorded because she was an amateur, right? She wasn't a member of the guild in the 1620s. And in fact, most guilds would not have taken her. She eventually became a member of the guild in 1633, right? So that could account for why she's not on Hals's roster of pupils. But again, to assume that she's a pupil is to assume that she's only good because she studied under somebody who was good, right? And even though she's influenced by him, most certainly, he doesn't have to have taught her how to do it. She could have gotten that on her own. She could have picked it up by just looking at his works, which were everywhere, and catering her own style to something that was really quite popular in Harlem at the time, right? But really, the more we look at these, again and again, we see the degree to which her works are, at the very least, in league with Halsey's, right? Similar topics treated in similar manners, right? These are almost the same size, and part of me wants them to be the same kid, or brother and sister or something like that, or brother and brother, right? Before and after the haircut, right? But I don't know. There's sort of no proof to that, right? That these belong together, but they are really similar in scale and size, and they reflect to us again the difficulty with which separating out their works, especially the unsigned works, are difficult for us. Right? When we were downtown a couple weeks ago, we saw the self-portrait that we have in the National. And again, the only solo self-portrait of Judith Leister. She appears in many of her other pictures, but this is her official likeness. This is her self-portrait. And we think that this was the work that she gave to the Harlem Painters Guild when she was admitted as a master, which was an extraordinarily rare thing, right? It was a huge honor to be admitted to the guild. It was rare for women to get admitted because it was a boys' club. It was rare for women to even be practicing artists, regardless of guild status. And guild status opened up all sorts of doors, right, for production and marketing your works. But even without that, it was difficult because the doors that were open to men were not open to women to finesse the craft, right? It was acceptable for a man to work from a nude male model, for example, right? Much less acceptable for a woman. So for Leister to have achieved guild membership was an extraordinary achievement, and definitely must have sort of been strong on her mind, right, as what an important thing, and something to celebrate, right? And it's not uncommon for artists to make paintings and gift them to a guild when they're accepted. That's kind of the norm. It's where the term masterpiece comes from, because you're accepted as a master in the guild, so you give them a masterpiece, something that demonstrates the reasons why you belong, your skill in training, right? This is the culmination. It's like your master's thesis, right? It's like your senior project, right? This is bring it all together, shows what you can do, right? And obviously, a bit more strict than we are in judging these things. We never reject anybody, or rarely, right? I rejected an honors thesis one year, just many years ago, because somebody didn't do their work. They just didn't. It was horrible. I wouldn't have accepted it as a term paper. Sorry?
I'm a little nervous.
You're fine. I would have told you already.
Imagine trying to paint with that collar.
Sorry? That's the thing. You see, Alec, that is exactly the point with this. Paint with that collar on. It's obviously not a collar you're going to paint with, right? So it goes back to this idea that that's the hallmark to this picture, right? Is how she's dressed, right? She's not dressed in studio togs, right? We know from other pictures a smock was normal, right? You would hang it up when you were done. You put it on over your clothing. And good and thick, so if you got paint on it, it wouldn't soak through, And she's not wearing that. She's wearing this extraordinary ruff, right? When we looked at the Old Lady by Frans Hals, we talked about the fact that thing she was wearing was kind of outdated. This is what young girls wore, right? This is hip. So it's expensive, it's hip, it's in, right? And it's wrong, because if that painting is wet, and we know it is, then you ruin your rough. That's a huge investment that you're going to destroy. So why is she dressed that way? Because the painting is about status, right? This painting is about her status as an artist, and doubly about her achieving that status despite her gender, right? And I think that's a huge part of this picture is the degree to which she's done this despite the impediments that came in the 17th century for trying to practice as an artist as a woman, right? So if you look across the lower border, she paints like Hall. She has these broad open strokes. The further you get from the face, she's showing off in a good way, right? I'm demonstrating my ability to paint, and that wonderful skirt down below really just breaks up to be a bunch of very loose brush strokes around the bottom of the chair. She holds more paintbrushes than anybody ever should, right? I mean, do you need that many paintbrushes? Unless each one is in a different color, right? So you don't clean it off. You don't have to have, if you have that many brushes, you don't need as much turpentine, right? You don't have to keep cleaning your brush to shift from one to the other, and you keep your colors nice and pure. But that's still 24 brushes at least in her hand, and she's holding them quite deftly, right? Between the knuckles of her first two fingers, while at the same time holding that palette with the paint on it. That looks almost like she squeezed it right out of the tube onto the surface, right? But again, I think this is about her dexterity, right? Her achievement. And then there's this other issue, which I really like this picture a lot. She's laughing. She's enjoying the hell out of this, right? And the person she's painting is laughing, right? And when we think about the laughing painter painting the laughing musician, then I think we're meant to say that there's a parallel between these two artists. The visual artist, the musical artist. She wants us to see them as paralleled, right? Each of them enjoying themselves so that you do as well, right? And this telegraphs what our response, she's laughing at the picture she's painting. We should laugh at the pictures that she's painted, though, of herself, right? And as we look at this detail, what we see is that she's holding the brush with almost the same pose as he's holding the bow, right? So that ties up that parallelism between the artist and the musician, right? Both of them are here to entertain, to create art. Right? And what's been noted by many people who write about this is that the paintbrush points at his male genitalia. Right? It just directs your eye right down toward his zipper. They didn't have zippers then, right? But you get the idea, and I think that's part of it as well. It's like she's saying, he gets to do this because he's a man, and I'm doing this despite being a woman. So that the achievement that any musician might have, and the sense of, achievement that they might have, it pales by comparison to what she's been able to accomplish, because she's not like them. Now, what I couldn't show you downtown when we saw this is that the paintings exist with this guy in them. He's one of her models, right? And she's not painting this painting because the edge of the canvas is wrong, right? But she's painting that guy. Right? And as we look at this picture, we see carousing musicians. The one in red looks like the fellow that we saw in looking at the bottle, the one inspecting if the bottle's empty or not, right? And again, there she is, right? In the background with them. Right? She's one of these professional actors. They're dressed up as actors, right? Semi-professional actors. And she's enjoying hanging out with them and carousing, drinking and singing and enjoying in merriment. And what I love about Leicester's work is the degree to which there's this infectious engagement with the subject matter on the part of her that it affects us and the way we look at it. And this picture, this just sold, by the way, in December, 1.8 million, right? In December. I know John's interested in sale prices, right? 1.8 million in December. So if you had 1.8 million euros, you might have been able to walk home with a license. I don't know where it wound up. Sotheby's sold it, or Christie's, one of the two, sold it, and it had been in private collection forever. So I got this picture from their online sales catalog, right? But the other thing I like about this picture on the right, and I think because it deals with some of the same themes that the self-portrait deals with, which is this detail. I just love this. So she's in this picture, she's carousing with these musicians, she's dressed up as one of these Commedia dell'arte figures, right? These are these Italian comedians. They're kind of like the Marx Brothers, right? We talked about them with Jan Steen. They're like the Raderreichers, right? Would often sort of derive some of their ideas from Commedia dell'arte, which go back to the 16th century. And that's where like Harlequin originally comes from, right? Punch and those sort of Puccinello and all of that, right, comes out of this. This tradition. But there she is, she's dressed up as one of them, and she's partaking with them as they dance and they sing and they laugh and they drink, right? And I just love this gesture. What's going on with that gesture, right? She's the happy person from a happy family, right? And she's pointing at the kids with the man leaning through the window. But what's up with that? What's the point of this gesture? What's the point of this detail of the picture? I sort of thought about it for a while, and I started thinking about myself, if we think of her as being the painter, the artist, an artist despite her gender. She's a single woman. She's not married yet. She's married in 1636. Right? She gets married. Has to stop painting. She puts out 5 kids in 13 years. Ouch. Right? Pretty much stops the career dead in its tracks. I think the statement is that I'm here because I don't have one of them. You know, that part of the statement of being a woman in a man's world is that part of the reason women couldn't compete was the expectations on them when family life came around. That they were the ones that were supposed to stay home with the kids, do the inside parts of the family. And she said, here they are, right? I'm separate from a family. That we presume that that's her husband and kids, but she doesn't have a husband and kids, and this is a self-portrait. So in many ways she's saying, this is why I can do this. That's how I'm reading it, right? I don't know if that's accurate or not. I think it works well enough if we think about other things that she does with her works and how she seems to be very much commenting on some of the tribulations of what it means to be a woman in a man's profession. Right? And that fits with this picture.
How do we know that that's her? Because it doesn't look that similar to
look at
her self-portrait.
Well, again, and this is a good question, Alec. How do we know for sure it's her? I think it does look like her self-portrait. That pug nose.
I didn't even think it was a woman at first.
Yeah. And it says quasi-androgynous, but okay, I look at the cheeks, I look at the nose in particular, I look at the eyes. I don't know. Okay, I'll ask you guys, do you think it's a self-portrait or not? You don't have to agree with me.
I can see it both ways. But also feel like her brother.
Her brother as well. I'd like to know more about her family that way, right? So we are talking about the same one, right? The one in the back in purple. Okay. And one of the things that comes out of this comparison, right, is that little... I'm looking primarily at the nose, right? And that's for me is the tell. But at the same time, the figure in red's nose is not dissimilar, right? And it could just be a sort of... Leonardo da Vinci once said that every painter paints themselves, right? So, in other words, projects themselves into their paintings in one way or another. And what he was talking about is that figures often look like the painter. So it's a good question to ask, Alec. In this particular class, it's her because I said so. but you don't have. But the beauty of art history and the beauty of all of the humanities as interpretive disciplines is you don't have to agree with that, right? I also think that some of the themes that she's dealing with, right, the fact that she would paint this as include something that references these kinds of pictures here, sort of suggests this makes a nice comparison because if you just isolate the woman or the figure in the back, androgynous figure in the back with the fellow in blue, you see in the portrait it's almost as if that part of the painting has been excerpted and redeveloped. Does that make sense? Right? And instead of her being with him as a music maker, she's now with him as the person who creates it. So that then suggests to me that this picture on the right, she sees as a projection of herself. These are the things I would point to, right? It's kind of, dare I say, Byzantine in its logic, right? In that use of the word as complex, overly complex as logic. But I think that if you look at that section, come over here, it's that there she is. So, but whether or not that's her, this is always, people raise the question because I think she, with the genre pictures, the full-on genre pictures, she alters it just enough, right, to give you pause to question. So this one's in the NMWA. Do you think that's her? In the middle? Right? There she's a little bit pudgier in the cheeks, right? I don't know if it's dated or not, right? So I don't know if the 1633 is a circa date, but he looks very much like, kind of like that guy, but not entirely, a little bit more sober, right? And there's enough of these by her where within the Mary groups, which seem to have been her biggest claim to fame, are figures that remind us quite significantly of her, right? So they raise very interesting questions as well. This one does. Because on a certain level, this also, we'll see this in other pictures tonight, right? A singer who follows the tune and the tempo of a musician is seen in literature and emblem books and various explanations from the 17th century as a representative of moderation, of temperance, of good judgment. Because you're not going off and doing what you want to do, right? You're modeling your actions to match the lead of someone else. So rather than being free and independent, you are instead cooperating, right? And putting the good of the group ahead of the good of the individual, right? So a singer following a musician, this is sort of an idea of how to interpret those. And that's exactly her here, right? She's the singer following the lead of two male musicians. And that, again, I want to sort of think about this as it seems as if Leicester is very much interested in investigating through allegory, through symbolism, what it means to be a woman in this profession. Because it's so extraordinarily rare, she has to have known its extraordinarily rareness, right? Now, music making also obviously comes with other overtones, right? Certainly the idea of cooperation is key. I wanted to show you some prints from around 1500 by a Dutch printmaker, Van Meckenem, Israel Van Meckenem. And he did a series of prints that have come to be known as scenes of everyday life. Whether they are or not is another issue. But there we see two musicians in harmony. This is a theme we've talked about in class a lot. Cooperation, right? Harmonious relationships. Is Leicester's picture on the right a harmonious relationship? Or is it a comment on one leads and the other follows, right? But many of the Van Meckenem prints, and there's a good chance she knows these, right? Overlay that with this other erotic overtone, right? That making music together has that sort of playfully erotic theme. And so for the harpist with the lute player, of course, we've talked about lutes, right? Now, a lute is more than, there are multiple meanings to the lute, right? And unfortunately for us, they are often self-contradictory, right? So we've talked about how we had a reading that talked about the lute as being a metaphor for the female body. And the idea of the man playing the lute is a man who is making women happy, right? Servicing them, I guess, or pleasuring them, making them sing. At the same time, a lute is notoriously difficult to tune. And so sometimes emblem books will mention that a lute player is sort of the exact opposite of a Lothario, right? Someone who's a seductor. And in fact, is a lute player is a symbol of a life well led, where all things are in balance and harmony. A guy who can keep it together, right? Is a lute player, because if you can keep a lute tuned while you play, then you can, keep your life in order, right? So these are really kind of all self-contradictory ways of approaching it. Erotic Lothario, Don Juan on the one hand, or dutiful, diligent taskmaster on the other. With Van Meckenem, there are a couple of things that are here that sort of add to it. He's got that stick coming down from the lute between his legs. And he's sitting on a three-legged chair, and one of the legs comes up right between his thighs, right? And these are subtle, but I think that they're part of it, right? The other prints in the series are also fit into that. Now, even though, again, pumping an organ can also be seen as cooperation, okay? Because you need somebody to do that in order to make your music, and you got to work together to make music. And sometimes we'll see organs being bellowed by same-sex couples, which has really nothing to do with eroticism. But in this case, I think it does, because of the bedroom that's right behind his head, right? That sort of adds to that idea. And the snarling little dog down below as well, growling at it. Maybe they're making horrible music together, right? But when we look at Leicester's image, we should keep in mind that there are sort of multiple ways to read this, right? A team in cooperation. We talked about that with that Honthorst, right? That's at the National Gallery, that beautiful concert picture. Or we could read it as sort of overtones of love. Right. And I'm bringing these in because part of me thinks that she knows these. The proposition picture, which is tiny, right? It's about the size of a print anyway. It's not much bigger than that, right? Shows a man coming and interrupting a woman working in needlepoint, right? Offering her money. And this other print from that same series shows a man coming to visit a woman who's busy making yarn, spinning yarn. And again, a cute little cat down there. Not so cute, but a monkey-faced cat down there. And again, what Van Meckenem is doing is he's letting us read it more than one way. Is it a sort of a happy intervention? Look at the feathers on his foppy hat, right? They look very much like the feathers we saw in some Leicester pictures as well. That sort of extraordinary, fantastic costume. But then, as he sits on his stool, he's playing with the hilt of his sword directly between his legs, right? And so that's really quite obvious. And he's coming here, and he's bothering her while she's working in a sewing-related profession or activity, right? Making yarn versus actual needlepoint. And we know that in Dutch that the word naaien, to sew, has a double entendre, right? A very nasty double entendre. It's a really mean slang. The difference, of course, is that Leicester's figure pays no attention to him at all. Does every artist paint herself? She kind of, again, has that sort of rounded cheeks, upturned nose. Doesn't look as much like her, I think, as the other ones do. But there's this sort of projection of like men coming in and bothering me while I'm working, right? Whereas with Van Meckenham's print, she's paying attention, right? She's distracted. Van Meckenham wants these to be read both ways. I have to just show you this because it's fun, right? The last one in the series, A Fight for the Pants, right, shows the woman now with a demon helping her beat the guy with her distaff. That's what she uses to make yarn with, right? And now she's whacking him over the head with it as they fight over a pair of trousers, right? So this really is about the battle of the sexes. And that's a pretty strong theme in art of the 16th century. And we should keep that in mind, that those are the background and the traditions for what Leicester's doing in the 17th century. Right. Now, 1633, she becomes a master in the guild. That's a huge feather in her hat, right? 1636, she gets married. Yeah, sure, please.
That demon made me think of the fact that it seems like in Dutch art at this time, especially compared to earlier medieval art or even later Middle Ages, they'll depict religious figures like Jesus and whatnot, but they never depict Satan, it seems like.
So you're talking about like 17th century artists. We don't see much in the
well,
way of demons.
Yeah, you'll see positive religious figures, but I don't know that I've seen, especially compared to earlier.
Yeah, compared to earlier, I think there are far, far fewer than we've seen earlier. I'm thinking now, the places that you're likely to see them in the 17th century would be the same places you'd be likely to see them in the 16th century, more likely to see them. That would be in printmaking.
Do you think it had to do with like having a different understanding of what hell was?
Or does it have to do perhaps with this interest in realism and the things of everyday life? And I think everywhere we've looked in Dutch art, even with the religious pictures, there's a way of sort of translating them into something that could happen in everyday life. And demonology ends up sort of divorcing itself from that, right? So for the Protestants, I don't want to talk for the Protestants, in Dutch art, even when you get something like the death of the Virgin, right, which is a Catholic theme that involves an apotheosis, right, heaven opening up on earth, or the Annunciation to the shepherds, right, you don't get, the focus is not on the interaction so much as it is on the human reaction. Does that make sense? So if I were to show you a French picture from the 17th century, or better yet, an Italian one, that dealt with some of the themes that we've seen Dutch artists deal with in a religious picture, that don't necessarily have demons in them either. Although I'd have to think that through, Alec. It's a good question. If we look at an Italian picture, we will see heaven spilling out, and the focus will be on what happens when heaven spills out into earth, when holy figures enter our realm. But with Dutch pictures, then, it's more about human reaction rather than the heavenly splendor. And so I'm thinking Rembrandt primarily, but with others as well. And where we do see images of demons, I'd have to go back to my visual memory of the Adam and Eve print that first couple weeks we read about Rembrandt's ugly bodies, right? And one of the principal pictures was Adam and Eve, that it's sort of based on a Dürer print of Adam and Eve. And what does the serpent look like there? We're getting demonology of sorts, right? And later tonight I have Cornelis van Haarlem's Adam and Eve back up. But I think you're hitting on a very good point, which is that issue of a decline in images of the supernatural.
Because my thought is almost like if they're Calvinist and they have this idea like we're elect, like we're already saved, we don't need to have
predestination,
hell. We don't have to have hell in the back of our mind.
Right, you don't need this as a motivation to do the right thing. Right? You have a social obligation to do the right thing. It's a really interesting point, Alec. You want to stay on another year and do another master's thesis? On why Dutch Protestant images ended up avoiding demonology? Because, I'm one of your readers. I can make that work for you. No. Right? So I don't have an answer for it. It's a really good point. What you would do, right, it's the same thing I've asked you guys to do. Toss your net out there. What else is out there? How do I explain what I think is a phenomenon here by looking and seeing? And I've never sort of done that methodically, right, to see what's out there that way. But it's a really good question. Sorry, I can't answer that. Just this morning, I found out that they had this down in the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts down in Richmond. This is the guy that Leicester married, Jan Mintze Molenaar. And we know some stuff about his biography. We know for a fact that he was a pupil of Frans Hals, okay, in the 1620s, before staving out on his own career in the 1630s and 40s, right? We know that for a fact. We also know that a majority of the things he did are very similar to what she was doing. Musical genre scenes. And that should really come as no huge surprise, given how popular these sorts of things were in Haarlem, where both of these artists are working. And our picture from Richmond looks just like sort of in a number of these Mary Company pictures, right? And, this is exactly where Leicester's pictures come from as well. They're tying into this long-standing tradition. So just like Boudewijk, in the Moritz house, we've got a fancy couple coming in from the right, and they are met with temptation, right? And the question is then, what do you then do? But if we look more closely, it's a really weird picture. It's not just a standard Mary Company on a terrace. That Molenaar is upending it because he includes things that are just wacky in it. And that changed this issue. So with Boudewijk, right, it's all about overindulgence and whether or not you partake in overindulgence, right? And with Molenaar, he complicates it. If you look closely, I'm sorry I could not get a good, large image of this. That's the best I could do. But there's violence in the background. It looks like a knife fight or something, right? There's the guy with his arm around the back of the fellow in yellow. He's got a knife in his hand, right? So ostensibly we have murder past the edge of the terrace, okay? So this really colors how we read the picture. And the other weird thing, and there are monkeys in others of these. The Boudewijk had a monkey in it. But here the monkey is cuddling a kitten, right? Snuggling a cat. And nobody seems to care, except the dog, right? Who's seen this and is now questioning what the hell's going on here, right? And so what has been interpreted with this, going back to the 70s, is that the young couple is a newlywed. And what they are confronting are options, one of which is temperance, cooperation, fidelity in marriage, and the other of which is the exact opposite. And the question is, what are they going to do? So our figures that are playing music in the center, we have three figures playing music. We have three other figures who aren't, and then we have this background scene, right? And that these present to us this dichotomy, this choice between temperance and intemperance, right? Between faithfulness and infidelity. It also is kind of interesting because when we begin to dive into it, it reminds us the degree to which whenever we interpret a work of art, we got to step back and look at how else those same themes have been used elsewhere. We really got to do that because our interpretation is based entirely on whether or not there's a tradition for this, whether or not there's a convention for this, right? So the fellow behind the female singer, right, is pouring water from a pewter can very skillfully into a glass of wine, right? So down below her shoulder he's holding the wine and he's up here giving it all of that, right, into the wine. And that theme of pouring from a water pitcher into a glass of wine is a long-standing attribute of the personification of temperance. Like whenever we see temperance personified, and you can see even in the description, temperensis, right? Whenever we see temperance personified, she appears in one of two guises, and this is one of them, right? That's a print after a design by Goltzius, right? Our old friend Goltzius. And why is this temperance? Two reasons. You're watering down wine. Okay, duh. Right? When I go to art openings on Friday night on campus, I always put an ice cube in my wine because I don't want to get stupid, before the opening's over. Especially the president's going to be there, right? Even though she might have too much. I don't know if she did. I'm just saying that. The other reason is it's skillful, right? It's really diligent. To be able to do that, it shows extraordinary care, right?
It's interesting that I immediately think that, it's the Mass. It's like the blessing of the water.
Oh.
And I know this is Protestant, right? But like when the transubstantiation is occurring, the priest pours holy water into the cup to bless the wine.
I'd be curious if Protestants do that as well, right? I don't know. That's a really interesting. I hadn't thought about this sort of this.
Lutherans do, but
Well, so this came from Van Til. This is the interpretation he wrote in Semiolis back in the 70s, right? If we think about that idea of sacrament and his reading of the couple at the right as being a newlywed, he even goes so far as to say he thinks it's a portrait. The couple that's might have been a gift at their wedding. I don't know if there's any proof for that, but I did find out that with this picture, before Richmond got it in the 19th century, it was listed as the figure on the right as a portrait of Dirk Hals, right? Because Molinar studied under Franz, right? But there's no proof for that, right? It hasn't held up. Nobody says that anymore. But still, there's this idea that the couple on the right might be a portrait, right? And this could then be something that celebrates the sacrament of marriage. To have other sacramental elements in the back could make some sense. And then but genreified, right? So in the same way that you get the kids on the left sort of washing the wine cups as well, right? Adding into that. So I hadn't thought about that, but that's an interesting possibility. This also just reminded me of something we'd seen before, which is when I talked about this, I just looked at it as a wonderful still life element. But then you realize that what might be happening here, I don't know if he's pouring wine. It looks kind of red from a distance, right? Or if they're watering down the wine, if there's already water in the cup and he's adding the wine to it. But that idea of that figure there is maybe the only one there that's doing any kind of concentrating. Well, that's not true. The other ones are concentrating quite well on drinking and whatnot, right? But with this image, just like with Molinar's image, right? And by the way, Jan Steen studied under one of Molinar's pupils. So he's going to know his works, right? He's in Haarlem. But one of the things Molinar does is he tends to set up these scenes and then give us a little something that offsets it, right? So most of it is about partaking in marriage as a diligent, cooperative venture, right? Fidelity and the rewards of that. But then there's these little things that upend that. The fighting figures and the monkey, right? So is Stain doing the same thing where he gives us an image about poor parenting, blah, 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 and then he gives us one figure in there to offset it, right? The diligent figure, the temperate figure, through modeling it after this old emblem of temperance, right? That's a possibility. We saw this with Leicester, but the woman who sings while the men play, right, is seen as, again, cooperation, right, diligent role-playing, and that seems to be the case here. We talked about the fact that lute players are also seen not only as erotic lovers, but also as diligent musicians in the fact that they're so hard to tune and keep tuned. But then there's these elements that play with that theme. The figure who looks into the pot, going back to emblem books, is gluttony. Because he's making sure he's taken the last drop, making sure there's nothing left. And Hals's two boys from the Frans Hals Museum is this. He's called the can looker, the kannekaker, right? He's looking into the can to make sure there's no more booze left, right? Swilling the last possible point. And our boy here, who's bringing cups over for the girl to clean, is also making sure there's nothing left in the pot, right? So little elements that begin to twist the meaning away from simply diligence to an inclusion of both, right? And then there's the monkey, and we'll quit after this. The monkey embracing the cat. Really rare. Monkeys are common, cats are common. Monkeys hugging cats, and that is not a happy cat, is pretty uncommon. And the only place that I've ever seen it before is in this Fall of Man image, right, by Cornelis van Haarlem, which is a monster picture, right? It's huge. They're over life size, the figures are. I love how Eve looks almost blue, right, because she's never outside, supposedly. And there's a monkey and a cat hugging at the base of the tree of knowledge. Notice, Alec, that the serpent even is anamorphized into human. It's not demonic looking or anything along those lines, right? And there they are. And there the cat seems a little bit more pleased by this. But look at the monkey's face and the hugging of the cat. Cornelis van Haarlem's work was on display in a public venue in Haarlem. So Molinar knows it, right? And it's one of the only other images that has a monkey and a cat commingling, hugging. And for Molinar, it's really complicated, and it's a bit of a sort of a interpretive dance. Temperance. Temperance shows up as a figure pouring water into wine. Okay, very show-offy because you've got to aim as part of it, right? The other way that temperance appears is as a figure with a set of reins for horses. Because temperance, pulls you in. You do what's right. You do what you're told to do rather than just what you will, right? So Bruegel did a series of the 7 deadly sins and the 7 cardinal virtues in around 1560, right? Made the drawings. They were sent off. Professional engravers made engravings after them, and they're widespread, right? So this is temperance, one of the 7 cardinal virtues. And we see temperance enacted almost everywhere. And some of the themes we've seen before, there's the bellows on the organ, cooperation. Singers following the lead of musicians, cooperation, right? Students with their teacher in the lower right corner, I like that. Cooperation. And in the figures, the embodiment, or in the center, is the embodiment of this idea of temperance. And you can see he's got a horse's bit in his mouth and he's holding onto it. So reins and chains are also a symbol of temperance because they control us from our base nature. Right? And the monkey's complicated because the monkey's not controlled from his base nature. Even though he's chained up, he's still doing something carnal, right? Animalistic. He's grabbed that cat, and against the cat's will, he's hugging it. I mean, with the Cornels van Haarlem, the monkey's Adam and the cat is Eve. I mean, it's pretty straightforward, really simple there, right? This is the idea of adding a carnal element to the fall of man. It's about giving over to your physical whims, right? But here, it's much more complicated than that, right? It ties into that idea about not giving over to your carnal whim, but at the same time, he's made it more complicated. And I think that's with Molinar. One of the interesting things about Molinar for me is the degree to which he sets up these standard kinds of images, and then he'll throw something in that just is like it's sand in the oil, right? It just mucks it up. It doesn't make sense anymore in the standard way of reading it, right? And so we'll look at a couple more of these, and then we'll move on to others past that. So let's take our break at this point. Let's take till about 1:15 on that clock, and then we'll come back and we'll continue looking at Molinar, and then we'll look at his pupils, including Jan Steen.